Hi, I'm Elaine Chow, in for Jamie Poisson. Last week, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman said the latest version of ChatGPT, which is expected to come out later this month, will be so good that it's kind of scary.
There are these moments in the history of science where you have a group of scientists look at their creation and just say, what have we done? Maybe it's great, maybe it's bad, but what have we done? Like maybe the most iconic example is thinking about the scientists working on the Manhattan Project in 1945, sitting there watching the Trinity test and just, this thing that had, it was a completely new, not human scale kind of power, and everyone knew it was going to reshape the world. And I do think people working on AI have that feeling in a very deep way.
That's Altman speaking with Theo Vaughn on Vaughn's podcast. Altman, of course, has an interest to talk up how powerful his company's product is, though some experts say it's nowhere near what would be considered truly intelligent. It's not the first time Altman has invoked the Manhattan Project, the American race to build a nuclear bomb during the Second World War. In fact, that's how he first pitched his ambitious plan for artificial intelligence. The sales pitch made to Elon Musk worked. Altman was promised $1 billion for the project and was even given a name by Elon, OpenAI. OpenAI would go on to launch ChatGPT in 2022, which became, at the time, the fastest growing app in history. In a new book, tech journalist Karen Hao chronicles the company's secretive and often zealous pursuit of artificial general intelligence. Hao not only pulls back the curtain on what's happened behind the scenes at the company as it went through an astronomical rise and some very public controversies, but also the very real impact as it pulls resources and labor from countries like Kenya and Chile to advance its technology. Karen's book is called Empire of AI: Dreams and Nightmares of Sam Altman's OpenAI. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Lynn.
So you profiled OpenAI in 2020, 2 years before the launch of its most popular product, ChatGPT, and you were catching them really at a bit of a crossroads then. How did OpenAI see itself at that time?
Yeah, OpenAI was very much at an inflection point, as you point out back then, in that they started as a nonprofit, but then they realized that the particular path of AI development that they wanted to pursue required a lot of capital. So right before I got there, they had restructured to have a for-profit arm nested within the nonprofit, and then they received $1 billion from Microsoft. And so they still very much thought of themselves as a nonprofit, and they still embodied their original ethos, which was more academic, more we're a bunch of nerds doing research. And they weren't really thinking much about building products at all. But there was certainly starting to be a sense that that would need to happen someday because of the investments that they were receiving with expectation of returns. So what I realized when I was embedding within the company is that even though they said that they were a highly transparent organization, they were going to open source everything, that they were ultimately developing AI without any consideration for profit, that internally, because of all the restructuring that they were doing, they'd actually started becoming exactly the opposite of what they said. They were very secretive, very competitive, and they did not actually intend to ultimately stay a nonprofit. They needed to aggressively race in the commercial realm.
To do what we needed to go do, we had tried and failed enough to raise the money as a nonprofit. We didn't see a path forward there. So we needed some of the benefits of capitalism, but not too much. I remember at the time someone said, as a nonprofit, not enough will happen. As a for-profit, too much will happen. So we need this sort of strange intermediate.
And so even though they themselves culturally still felt like they were retaining a lot of their roots, this was not actually the truth of the matter.
I've heard you say that Sam Altman, founder, CEO, as a manifestation of OpenAI. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it was sort of the opposite way around in that I think OpenAI is a manifestation of Altman,
Mm.
in that Altman is very much a product of Silicon Valley. His entire career was spent in the tech industry and internalizing a lot of its ideologies around the idea of building startups to blitz scale them, this concept of aggressively growing them super fast, this idea of always trying to be ever more ambitious by adding zeros to the amount of money you want to raise, the amount of users you want to acquire, and the speed at which you do so. The idea that there is a winner takes all game, and ultimately every startup should aim to achieve monopoly. Otherwise, they are going to lose in that race.
We knew that scaling computers was going to be important, but we still really underestimated how much we needed to scale them.
So does that suggest that nobody can do AI as a nonprofit in any kind of a meaningful way?
No, there are other things that you can do for sure, but to be at the front of scaling research, I think you probably can't do that as a nonprofit.
So you can see all of those elements with OpenAI.
One of the key pursuits for OpenAI is like unlocking AGI, or artificial general intelligence, when a machine is able to do what humans can do, human level intelligence, right?
So one of the things that's sort of important to understand is that artificial general intelligence is a ill-defined term because there's no scientific consensus around what human intelligence is. So the idea that we might be able to recreate something that we don't really understand is kind of up in the air. And there's a lot of scientific debate on whether or not AGI is even possible. But Altman identified early on in his career that in order to motivate a large group of people, you need to give them a mission. You need to give them a sense of purpose. You need to give them belief. And I open my book with this quote that he cites in 2013 in a blog post. Successful people build companies. More successful people build countries. The most successful people build religions. And 2 years later, then he founds OpenAI and he pegs its mission to this idea of artificial general intelligence. So to me, the reason why OpenAI pursues this goal, or the reason why Altman articulated this, is because he wanted to rally talent, rally capital, rally resources around a religion, around this belief that it is possible to recreate human intelligence.
Altman has brought up, and I'm thinking of his comments in 2023 to Congress, about how he believes AGI can lead to solving climate change, curing cancer, creating job opportunities.
Our current systems aren't yet capable of doing these things, but it has been immensely gratifying to watch many people around the world get so much value from what these systems can already do today. We love seeing people use our tools to create, to learn, to be more productive. We're very optimistic that there are going to be fantastic jobs in the future, and that current jobs can get much better.
And the need to not slow down, because or else it would lose pace to China.
I think we want America to lead. We want.
So get to the perils issue, though, because I know.
Well, that's one. I mean, that is a
colleagues,
peril,
right?
which is you slow down American industry in such a way that China or somebody else makes faster progress.
And what do you make of those justifications?
So one of the reasons why I call my book Empire of AI is because I make this argument that these companies need to be thought of as empires. They're consolidating an extraordinary amount of economic and political power. And one of the features of empire is that they engage in a narrative that there are good empires and evil empires in the world. And the good empire, have to be an empire in the first place to be strong enough to beat back the evil empire. And, all empires have civilizing missions. This idea that if the evil empire gets a hold of the technology first, humanity's going to be totally devastated. But if we, the good empire, get it first, then we can civilize the world and bring progress and modernity to all of humanity. And so Altman basically, when he's saying AGI might be able to cure cancer, it might be able to solve climate change, and all of this will not come to pass, and even worse things will come to pass if China gets it, is literally, the playbook of any empire. But what I would say is, if you look at the track record of what this pursuit has gotten us, it has not gotten us any closer to curing cancer, solving climate change. It is, in fact, actually led to capital consolidation towards technologies that are not doing that, and away from technologies that could be mitigating climate change and curing cancer. And at the same time, the argument that China is the evil empire, Silicon Valley has long used that to try and ward off regulation, with this idea that if they're not regulated and they use export controls to increasingly constrain the amount of computing power that China can get access to, that it's going to widen the gap between US and China, and that the US will then be able to develop all these technologies that have a liberalizing effect on the world. And actually, what has happened in the last decade is exactly the opposite. The gap between the US and China has continued to decrease. China has weaned itself off of American computer chips, and American technology platforms have had an illiberalizing effect on the world. So it ultimately, all of this rhetoric is really just self-serving.
Not everyone within OpenAI felt the same way as Sam Altman.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through a bit of some of those kind of fractures within the company?
Yeah, so OpenAI has long been plagued by two factions. One is the boomers. They believe that AGI will bring us to utopia. The other faction is the doomers. They believe AGI could devastate all of humanity, as in potentially kill all humans in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And even though both of them conclude that they should work on AGI and that they should control AGI development, they have different ideas of how to do that. Boomers think we need to build this technology as fast as possible so that we can then release it into the world, because that will bring utopia faster. And doomers think we should build this technology as fast as possible, but then not release it so that we can continue to do research in a tightly controlled environment to make sure that it doesn't ultimately kill everyone. And so through OpenAI's history, there's just been all of this clashing between the boomers and doomers on ultimately what the company should do and how quickly they should do it, how quickly they should release their technologies, and so on.
And often some of those fractures actually lead to other AI companies developing down the line, right? Like people who disagree with Altman and then go on to develop their own thing. But it just all kind of still fosters kind of the same goals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Elon Musk fractures with OpenAI, develops XAI. Dario Amodei fractures with OpenAI, develops Anthropic. Ilya Sutskever fractures with OpenAI, develops Safe Superintelligence. Mira Murati fractures with OpenAI, develops Thinking Machines Lab. I mean, it's just a repeated thing. And so one of the things that's important to understand about the AI race today is it's actually not just a profit. It's not just about money. It's actually also about ideology. Like, these people are splintering and forming their own companies because they have a philosophical difference with how OpenAI is doing it, and they want to do it, quote unquote, better.
I want to take a moment, a little bit of time on Ilya Sutskever in particular, co-founder of OpenAI, former chief scientist. Can you tell me a little bit more about him?
Yeah, so these boomers and doomers, like, they themselves use the phrase belief. They identify as AGI believers. And Ilya Sutskever is a diehard AGI believer. And he was one of the co-founders of OpenAI. He was the first ever chief scientist and then continued to play a very prominent role. And in the early days, his role was he was very effective at attracting other AI researchers to the company because he was already quite a famous AI researcher by the time he became a co-founder of OpenAI. He was one of the co-authors of a very, very influential, if not the most influential AI research paper that was published in 2012. And so he already was an AGI believer when he started, but he just became even more of an AGI believer 8 years in, when OpenAI's technologies were rapidly progressing and he was seeing with his own eyes this rapid progress. And so he started becoming very religious. People would describe him and his behaviors as kind of like a prophet, where he would pace up and down company meetings and speculate about the profound civilizational changes that could happen once AGI arrived. And he was very torn about whether it would be a profoundly positive thing or a profoundly negative thing. But he would use language like, we need to build a bunker before we release AGI onto the world. And we need to think about the deep responsibility that we have. And at one point, in order to instill that kind of responsibility among OpenAI researchers, he commissioned an artist to create a good AGI figurine, a wooden effigy. And during a technical retreat with other researchers at the company, he created a ceremony where he enacted out this wooden effigy, represented a good AGI that then we discover is actually lying and deceitful. And as a bunch of other senior scientists were standing around this fire pit in a semicircle wearing bathrobes, he puts lighter fluid on the wooden effigy and lights it on fire.
It's quite the image.
Yeah.
By simply looking at what AI can do, not ignoring it, when the time comes, that will generate the energy that's required to overcome the huge challenge that AI will pose. And the challenge that AI poses, in some sense, is the greatest challenge of humanity ever. And overcoming it will also bring the greatest reward. And in some sense, whether you like it or not, your life is going to be affected by AI to a great extent. And so looking at it, paying attention, and then generating the energy to solve the problems that will come up, that's going to be the main thing.
Sutskever was also a key player in what became a very public ousting of Sam Altman by the board at OpenAI in 2023. And you kind of pull back the curtain on that. You know, obviously there was a lot of media coverage of that at the time.
Sam Altman, who has drawn comparisons to tech giants like Steve Jobs, was dismissed by the OpenAI board Friday.
Microsoft, the biggest investor in OpenAI, has hired him for their own research team and added a second interim CEO.
OpenAI posting on X that Sam Altman will now officially return as CEO.
But what would you say are some of the key things that the average person might not have gleaned from the mainstream media coverage of that ousting and then reinstatement of Sam Altman?
Yeah, so there were two forces at play that led to Sam Altman's ouster. One was this boomer-doomer clash that was happening within the company. The other force that was at play is that Altman's a very polarizing figure, and throughout his career, irrespective of when he was working on AI, he has been followed by both people praising him as potentially one of the greatest tech leaders of our generation, akin to Steve Jobs, and followed by allegations of being a liar, manipulator, and abuser. Essentially, during this time, after ChatGPT is released, the company is in a state of chaos because they didn't actually intend to release the fastest growing consumer app in history. They were actually releasing what they considered to be a research preview. And so they're scaling the company, both the servers that they need to serve up and keep ChatGPT running, and also the staff that they need at a faster pace than any other company in Silicon Valley history. And so there's all this like organizational chaos. There's the boomers and the doomers that are starting to clash more and more and more, because now all of these people around the world, hundreds of millions of people, are using ChatGPT, and each of them is seeing evidence of ChatGPT either doing wonderful things or ChatGPT being used to do very abusive things, and therefore each side is seeing clear evidence of why they were the ones that were right all along. And Altman, in the midst of this, is also stirring the pot and telling different people different things based on what they want to hear, and not really creating much of a sound environment at all for good decision making and governance processes. And so the board starts having serious concerns based on their more doomer-leaning ideology. And two executives, Ilya Sutskever and Mira Murati, the chief technology officer, also start having serious concerns. Sutskever also because of his more quasi-religious beliefs, and Murati simply because she just likes good governance, and she is very concerned that Altman's influence on the company is just adding more chaos to chaos. And so both of them approach the board saying, we don't trust Altman to be the one to lead us to AGI. And it so happens that the board was already engaging in those reflections. And so all five people, 3 independent board members and the 2 executives, start having intensive discussions. And after the independent board directors then break off into their own discussions, and they conclude by the end that they need to fire Altman.
Have you been able to get any comment from Sam Altman about that time, or actually with the reporting that you've done on OpenAI?
No, so OpenAI did not participate in the book at all. I gave them many opportunities to do so, and also gave them 40 pages of comment requests, and they declined to answer.
But you did talk to a lot of people who worked for OpenAI or used to, right?
Yeah, so I spoke to over 90 current and former OpenAI employees and executives, as well as over 40 other people within the tech industry, broadly speaking, and people that are close to Sam Altman personally.
You mentioned earlier that your focus on this idea of the empire of AI, a key part of that is kind of the footprint that a company like OpenAI has elsewhere in the world, in particular in the global south. And can you tell me a little bit more in broad strokes kind of around OpenAI's footprint in the countries that you reported from?
Yeah, so there are 2 main, I guess you could call them ingredients, that have led OpenAI to really sprawl out into the rest of the world. One is labor. They need contract workers to do data preparation, data cleaning, and content moderation in order to develop their AI models. And the other one is they need land, energy, and fresh water to house, power, and cool their data centers and supercomputers. And they have already effectively run out of land in the US to do this. And so they are trying to expand aggressively abroad. And so I went to Kenya, Chile, Uruguay, and I also drew upon reporting from Colombia and South Africa that I had previously done to try and paint this broader picture of all of the different parts of the AI supply chain that are happening around the world. And I met with workers in Kenya that OpenAI contracted to build a content moderation filter that would ultimately be used in ChatGPT. And what the filter was, it was basically going to be this thing that sat on all of OpenAI's models and then blocked any toxic content from ever reaching users. And what that meant for the Kenyan workers was they were wading through reams of the worst toxic content on the internet, as well as AI generated content where OpenAI was prompting its models to imagine the worst content on the internet. And then the workers had to read and label them into a detailed taxonomy of, is this hate speech, is this harassment, is this violent content, sexual content, and to what degree of severity? Is this sexual content that involves abuse? Does that abuse involve children? And the workers ended up experiencing the same challenges of content moderators during the social media era, where they became deeply traumatized by the work And it wasn't just them, it was their families and their communities that suffered when they lost a key member of their community to mental health challenges. So I talk about this one man, Mo Fadokinye, who was among the Kenyan workers that OpenAI contracted. He was on the sexual content team, and his personality fundamentally changed. He went from being very extroverted and gregarious to being very socially anxious and introverted. And he also didn't know how to explain to his family, to his wife and stepdaughter, why he was undergoing that transformation, because he didn't know how to say to them that his job involved reading sex content all day. That sounded really shameful. And so over time, without any ability to understand what was going on, his wife became more and more concerned and started having doubts about their marriage. And so one day she asked him for fish for dinner. He went to the store, bought 3 fish, one for him, one for her, one for the stepdaughter. And when he came back, all of their bags were packed and they were gone. And his wife said, "I don't understand the man you've become anymore. We're not coming back."
The kind of content moderation work that you've been talking about and the impact, like, is there anything different about how things are being done by a company like OpenAI versus other tech companies?
So one of the key differences is that these workers are moderating AI generated content as well as the stuff that's scraped from the internet. You know, with Facebook, usually content moderation is user generated content, but OpenAI was trying to give the workers a wide diversity of the worst content.
Right.
And so they were programmatically generating all of these different awful possibilities. The other key difference that is really important to understand is that content moderation for these generative AI systems, it's not actually necessary if the AI companies chose to develop their models in a different way. The reason why content moderation exists now for generative AI is because companies made a choice to train their systems on widely scraped data from the internet. But that is not actually the only way to train AI models. You can also curate your data sets such that you eliminate the need for content moderation altogether. So these companies, instead of doing their own work of data cleaning, they're offloading that to these workers in the global south and paying them a couple dollars an hour to do this very grotesque labor.
Another big issue that you write about is the environmental cost of not just OpenAI, but all AI development across the board. And can you paint a picture for me of just how resource intensive that technology is?
There are a couple stories that I include in my book, but there have also been some really great updates. So McKinsey projected that based on the current pace of data center and supercomputer expansion for AI specifically, we will need to add 2 to 6 times the amount of energy consumed annually in the state of California onto the global grid in the next 5 years. And the state of California, for some context, 5th largest economy in the world. And so this is an extraordinary amount of energy. And most of that is going to come from fossil fuels because these data centers and supercomputers have to be powered 24/7. And there was actually a report that just came out of the United Nations in June that said that the 4 major AI players increased their carbon emissions by 150% since 2020. So that is just in the last few years. And now we're seeing even more acceleration of these AI data centers, and there's going to be even more emissions. So we're talking about reversing a lot of the climate progress that was made in the last decade. And also the acceleration of air pollution problems because coal plants are having their lives extended. Methane gas turbines are being installed anew. And then there's also a dimension where fresh water is needed to cool these data centers. And so it's accelerating the fresh water crisis. Bloomberg recently had a story that showed that 2/3 of these data centers are going into water-stressed areas around the world. And that proportion is actually rapidly growing. So I profiled this one community in my book in Montevideo, Uruguay, where they were experiencing historic levels of drought to the point where the Montevideo government was mixing salt water into the public drinking water supply just to have something come out of people's taps when they opened them. And people who were too poor to buy bottled water were drinking that toxic water, and women were having higher rates of miscarriages because of that. And it was in the middle of that Google proposed to build a data center in Montevideo and use the fresh water that the people didn't even have. And that is ultimately the state of play for these data centers. Today, there are literally communities that are competing with this computational infrastructure for life-sustaining resources.
You know, the Trump administration announced the launch of the Stargate project back in January, and this is a joint venture with OpenAI and a few other companies where, you know, they will be investing up to $500 billion towards AI infrastructure over the next 4 years. Trump called it the largest AI infrastructure in history, quote, by far. And Karen, as we kind of close our conversation, like, what do you think, that says about where OpenAI is going next?
OpenAI is just continuing to aggressively build out its empire. I mean, they've already consumed so many resources, and yet they're trying to consume even more at an exponential rate of growth. You know, after the Stargate initiative was announced, Altman joked on a podcast, oh, $500 billion sounds like a lot today, but wait until you see me raise $5 trillion for a single cluster. And if these companies are not stopped, if there are not checks and balances on their aggressive, world-spanning ambitions, this is a huge threat to democracy. Like, if these companies are allowed to continue consolidating ever more wealth and power and economic and political leverage, they are fast becoming, if they haven't already become, the apex predator in the ecosystem, where they can just act with impunity in their self-interest however they want.
Karen Hao, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
That's all for today. I'm Elaine Chow. Thanks for listening to Front Burner.